All right, we're probably good to get started. Um, Hi again. My name's Ashley. I am the executive director of the University of Wyoming College of Law's Firearms Research Center. And I have two of my colleagues with me here tonight. I've got George Mocsary. George is the director of the Firearms Research Center. He's also a law professor at the university. And I also have Jody with us, Jody Madeira. She is on the advisory committee for the grant that we'll be talking about tonight, and she's also a professor at Indiana University. And they're a pretty good duo for us tonight because George and Jody have both co-authored different Second Amendment textbooks. So it's kind of a good little start for our program. But George, do you want to cue up the PowerPoint? What we're going to do tonight is we're going to go through the grant and some of our timelines. And then we thought we'd give kind of a preview to some of the conversations that we'll have throughout the 24-month grant. And Jody and George are going to kind of do a little example of that. They're going to have a conversation about collective versus individual rights when it comes to the Second Amendment. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about what our grant is. You can go to the next slide, George. So the University of Wyoming, our research center is housed in the College of Law, and we applied for a grant last summer. It was a Department of Ed grant that was placed in honor of the semi-quincentennial, which has become my new favorite word to say, of the United States. And it was a grant specifically for increasing civics literacy in secondary classrooms across the country. Obviously, being a firearms research center, we focused on the Second Amendment. And what we created was basically a 24-month project where we will be providing high school educators as well as middle school educators access to primary source materials and also giving them an opportunity to have kind of a professional development opportunity. So it's kind of twofold. We've got half of the grant is dedicated to creating materials that can be used in the classroom, and then half of it is introducing you all to scholars, people in the field, and letting you all meet each other and kind of have this broader dialogue about the Second Amendment. You know, it's one of those topics that is incredibly nuanced in and of itself, as we know pretty much anything is. But since it is such a hot topic in the United States, it can be really hard to get good information. It can be really hard to step out of your silos and hear information from people that maybe you don't agree with. And so we really tried to create a grant that is a politically neutral approach where you'll be able to hear from pretty much everyone on an array of topics related to the history of the Second Amendment, as well as kind of the modern conversation around guns. So George, if you want to go next. All right, so these are the project components. And the project components here, I mentioned we've got half of them are resources and then half of them are kind of professional development. And I'll go through these throughout this PowerPoint. But basically, we've got an instructional video series, a primary source historical law database that will have an internal AI search and summative feature. We will be doing a webinar series as well as kind of a capstone 2-day in-person conference. Next slide. All right. So our instructional video series. Now we're working on this right now. Like I said, we got our grant back last year. We got our grant in the fall, but with the government shutdown, things were kind of back and forth and it was a little slow moving. So we are working on the video series now. And this will be 12 videos. They'll be about 8 to 10 minutes. And this is kind of something that you can use in the classroom, but also, you know, if you're not very well versed in the Second Amendment, hopefully this will be a good kind of resource for you as well. This is kind of our overview of historical kind of Second Amendment topics. And it's basically going to be fact-based, fact-oriented, and just kind of about that evolution and not the commentary that you'll get in some of the other components of the grant. So what we've got is the text and structure of the Second Amendment, collective versus individual right, which you'll hear a little preview about tonight. The militia, sorry, it's 8 o'clock where I'm at. The militia in colonial and founding era America. The term founding era is something you're going to hear a lot while we talk about kind of the Second Amendment because of the 2022 Bruin decision. It was a Supreme Court decision that kind of really thrust the historical tradition of firearms laws into the forefront of determining the constitutionality of modern laws. And the founding era is one of those eras they talk about, which is around the ratification of the Second Amendment. Then we've got race, citizenship, and the right to bear arms in what we call the second founding era, which is around the ratification of the 14th Amendment. We'll have a video on state constitutional analogs and how kind of the states interpret the Second Amendment over time. Second Amendment and self-defense jurisprudence with the Castle Doctrine, and then a selection of big federal laws that have impacted kind of 20th century firearms dialogue, and that's the National Firearms Act in 1934, which regulated suppressors, short-barreled rifles and shotguns, and machine guns. The Gun Control Act, which made it mandatory to put a serial number on firearms, did some import restrictions, started kind of the beginning process of tracking guns, and so it had lots of components to it. The Owners Protection Act, which was kind of a build on of the '68 law, and also included a full machine gun ban for civilian ownership. We also we'll have a video on the modern legal landscape, which will look at more modern Supreme Court cases like Heller, McDonald, and Bruin, which I already mentioned. The role of the ATF and federal regulation. Firearms technology and their legal implications. This has been a really big topic over the past few years since that Bruin decision, because kind of the evolution of that technology and what was around at the founding era, second founding era, is very important. But then also how we define firearms with the ATF. I mean, you may not know, but most firearms made before 1898 that are not machine guns are not legally firearms at the federal level. So it'll kind of cover a bunch of that. Firearm safety and civic responsibility. And then finally, firearms and violence, and looking at what the data shows and kind of talking about the way that we define certain studies, how people utilize evidence, how they define things like mass shootings, how they define homicides, different levels of violence, suicide prevention, and kind of looking at where those sources come from and how you can analyze it. You can go to the next slide. And then I'm going to pass this on to George, because this has been George's baby, our primary source historical law database. He can talk a little bit more about what he's been working on with that.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. So we are working on part of the grant is to create a database of historical laws related to firearms and some weapons laws as well. One reason for that is that much of the and now, really since Bruin, pretty much all of Second Amendment jurisprudence is based on laws that were enacted and regulations that were enacted and what courts said about those regulations certainly at the founding era, and it's somewhat of an open question whether laws at the second founding will matter as well. And so the idea, and I'm going actually to share my screen here and show you what we're looking at here. What we're doing is creating a database that'll be open to the public that shows various kinds of laws. And I've started on this page here. This is a demo here, and it's not a demo. This is production, but it's still a work in progress. So it's just some text up here that'll be updated. And then you can see down here we have laws collected up from every state and territory, and some others as well. West Virginia, Wyoming. The United Kingdom is in here as well. And the one reason for that is that a lot of the scholarship and work around the Second Amendment and Second Amendment history goes back to England, goes back to United Kingdom and the laws in effect there. And so there are laws in the database going back to the 3-digit numbers. I think there's one from the 800s at least. And then for example, the famous statute of Northampton is in there as well. There's some territorial laws as well. But looking by state or territory isn't the only way you can look. So you can do a search if you'd like. And one thing you might want to search on is swords. Let's say arms in the Second Amendment is broader than just firearms. We tend to think of them as just being about firearms, but things like swords and knives and billy clubs are also arms, and there are lots of cases around those. And so you can search for things like that in the text of the statutes, and the database will show you everything that has sword in it, for example. You can see some filters on the side here. various kinds of coverage that you can get. So Arizona, the territory versus Arizona, the state. Uh, you can search by the title of the statute, which probably isn't very important for most people, but some statutes, some of these laws are in collections that are known by the name of the collection. And so that might be helpful. Maybe most interesting is this one here by subject. So everything from armed forces, firearms regulations in the militias. Well, we're working on getting militia laws uploaded into here, about 100 of them. Carry, various kinds of carry restrictions, and summed up to the high level here. Um, and by coverage, you can see that Alabama is broken down into various cities and counties in Alabama. There are some county level laws, there are some city level laws, and so on. Alaska is at the state level and the territory level as well, and so on. Um, the database, if you go into one of the records, and let's just start with Alabama here, you can look at a law, and on the page, you can read an abstract of the law, a summary, and the text. This abstract field will go away. It'll be a summary of the statute and the text of the statute, and you can read about it and understand it and use these as teaching tools. It gives you some information about the law. And then if you want to give you an opportunity to see the law in context, you can click on it and actually either go out to a public source that has the law on it. And the goal here was to enable viewers to look at the law in context. So you can go forward and backward in the pages. Sometimes it's happened that courts have cited laws that sound like they're saying one thing, but when you look at it in context, you can see that they're saying something else. And so the idea is to give viewers complete access to the law and everything surrounding it. In some circumstances, there isn't a public version of the statute out there. And here's an example. In those situations, you can see this is just an example. We're working on loading the database up, where we'll have scans of the statute ourselves. And you can see the statute, and you'll be able to go backward and forward to see 5 pages on either side of the text with the law and the front matter in the source in question. Um, the idea is to make all of this information available to the public, to everyone who just might have an interest in these historical laws. One thing we're adding to the database is an AI-powered chatbot. So we're hoping that the version that you see here will be out in the summer and available to the public. Um, the next phase of the project, excuse me, is to enable a chatbot that lets you use a natural language search to find statutes. You would just tell it exactly what kind of statute you're looking for, and it'll come back with various options. Um, and you can ask it various questions about statutes and so on. And that'll be powered by a large language model that sits on our servers um, and is trained on the data in all of these statutes. Everyone who participates in the grant will certainly have access to the chatbot. The database will be open to the public. If all goes as hoped, we recently had a breakthrough, and it looks like we'll be able to, as I just mentioned, have the LLM and the AI sitting on our servers, in which case we'll be able to open it to the public as well. And with that, I will go back, Ashley, to the presentation. There we are.
Thanks, George. And then you can go to the next slide.
There we are.
Moving away from kind of the resources that we're going to be providing we're moving into the kind of professional development realm. And this is the first thing that we're offering, which is a webinar series. And also, if you have any feedback on the time that we're doing this, we were planning on doing our webinars around the same time to give everyone a chance from the Pacific Coast to the East Coast a chance. But if you guys have any opinions on that, we'd love to take it, because we haven't set our first webinar, but that will start in the fall. And we will have 8 webinars. You'll see a little bit of an example of this today between George and Jody, but it'll be a much larger scale. So these topics will be more surrounding contemporary topics, so flashpoint topics, things you hear about today, because we want to be able to give you kind of an opportunity to interact with scholars of differing opinions, see where they disagree, where they do agree, where they're coming from, the scholarship that they're using to justify their position. And that way you can kind of take something that maybe you hear about more in the news or in conversations and get a better sense. And then the important part to this, though, is that we want you to be able to interact with these scholars, to ask these scholars questions. And so we're doing this current webinar, this current informational session as a Zoom webinar, but we will do these webinars as more of a regular Zoom so that you can be on the screen and you can ask questions directly. You don't have to type it, just so it feels a lot more conversational than us just talking at you, because we want you guys to be able to engage with the material rather than just kind of telling you what it is and then moving on. So our webinar series, like I said, it'll start in the fall. We will kind of iron out all the topics. The topics may change a little bit just because as something maybe goes to the Supreme Court and becomes more relevant, we may do something on that and kind of switch out a different topic. But this, we've got kind of a list of things we proposed in the grant that we may be talking about. Our first one, though, will be more on why we have a Second Amendment. Where do scholars trace the Second Amendment? What are their approaches to understanding the Second Amendment, and then how they interpret it from there. You can go to the next one, George. And then finally, we will have an in-person conference in the summer of 2027. And we got funding to accommodate 100 teachers so we can cover the costs of your travel. We haven't decided exactly where it's going to be. We're kind of split between either doing it in Wyoming because we have the university there, or doing it someplace that's more centrally located that would be easier for you guys to get to. But we kind of wanted to see, when we really get rolling with things this summer and into the fall, kind of where everyone is, and if there's kind of a concentrated area that would be easier for people to get to. Wyoming's beautiful in the summer, but it's not always the easiest place to get to. So for the conference, it'll be 2 days. Oh, and I forgot to mention, we will also be live streaming a lot of it. So if you're not able to attend, or if you apply and you don't get into it, then you'll still have access to it, and it'll be posted online on our website in perpetuity. So the first day is going to be much more about your regular conference format. We will basically bring in scholars and we'll dedicate the whole day to having deeper conversations about the Second Amendment. This outline is just a rough outline. By the summer of this year, I'll have the exact, programming, but you will look at kind of the early period that we've mentioned, and then maybe the 20th century and moving forward, and then have some roundtable with legal historians that are kind of, really top in their field. But then the second day, I'm really excited about, because I'm a public historian and museum professional. That's my background. So this day will be dedicated more towards workshops. So we'll break up into smaller groups and then take information that we've kind of talked about and then kind of figure out how we can teach this in the classroom in a way that's nonpartisan, but then also recognizing that this topic to everybody can be really difficult to talk about, kind of to adults in the current gun debate, but then also when you're trying to have a conversation with students about something that's very politically charged, very emotional for a lot of people, especially in schools. Today, we want to kind of help you guys work out how we can navigate potentially controversial topics and difficult questions. So we'll kind of workshop that. We'll probably partner with a few other institutions on how to kind of manage that. And then in the afternoon, we'll have some level of kind of firearm safety training. We also have, we will have some component of public health in terms of kind of mental health, and suicide prevention. One of the pillars of the research center as a whole is kind of community outreach. And so we do a lot with firearm safety in the community. We also do a lot with suicide prevention in the community. And we recognize, with limited resources in the schools for kind of mental health support, that this is probably a topic that we can provide at least some dialogue on. And we've got, I'll mention here, I think it's in the next slide, kind of our project team. We've got someone from the VA, and we also have someone from a mental health organization that works with the gun community on destigmatizing mental illness, but then also works with clinicians on better understanding firearms and firearms owners. So it'll be a good 2 days. And like I said, we'll be able to cover the expenses for the teachers who participate in that. Next slide. So I mentioned an advisory committee at the beginning of this, but I wanted to kind of talk about our project team a little bit, just for kind of transparency. We wanted to make sure when we were creating this that we were getting a well-rounded group of people that come from a bunch of different backgrounds, but then also very differing beliefs when it comes to the study of firearms. So obviously, George and I, we got permission from the grant to hire some help, which is lovely. We've got a research director that we've just hired. We have a post grad assistant. And then, very, very importantly, we're in the process of hiring an external evaluator. So, the really important thing is our external evaluator who will be looking at not just kind of the information that we provide and how it's evolved over time, but then also how politically neutral we're remaining. So they will be evaluating us at multiple points throughout the grant to kind of tell us if we need to change some of our approach, some of our dialogue, bring in some different people, just so that we can make sure that we're giving you guys the best experience possible with that. And so we're bringing that person on hopefully in the next couple of weeks. Are finishing up their contract. And then our advisory committee, whom they're meeting with us quarterly, but we're in constant communication, having them vet all of our information. We've got our senior personnel. We have representatives from the UW College of Education, including one that is also a public educator. He is a civics teacher who has worked with a lot of kind of Bill of Rights and civics leadership organizations across the country. And then we also have another civics teacher out of Indiana who has a background in kind of firearms instruction and education. I mentioned already our public health specialists that we have from the VA and Walk the Talk America, which is the organization. Our Second Amendment scholars, we've got Jody, who's here today, and then another is Nicholas Johnson, who I realize I misspelled his name there, who's a law professor from Fordham. And then for kind of the firearm safety component of this, we have an educator down in Atlanta who not just is a firearms educator, but he also works a lot with the inner city youth in Atlanta and Chicago, and works with them in the school systems, outside of the school system. So he's bringing a good perspective from that as well. So next slide, George. All right, so our timeline, best laid plans. We are planning to release a version of the database for you guys without the AI feature this summer. So you guys will pretty much get one of the first looks at the way the database is going to, operate. We wanted to kind of work around your timeline. So we've gotten a lot of advice that if we want to put out resources, let's put out resources when you're not in school because you guys are busy, and also to put it out so that you may be able to incorporate it into your classrooms as we move along. I mentioned our fall webinar. Our series will begin in the fall. We'll do 3 webinars this fall, 3 in the spring, and then we'll continue doing them through the rest of the grant. My goal is to have the instructional videos done by the winter to try to get to you guys during your winter break. Like I said, we've selected the topics. We're researching them. We're writing the scripts. We just have to make sure we can film and edit them by then, but that is the goal. By the spring of 2027, we plan to have the full database with the AI feature for you guys, which you guys will be getting for free. And then we'll put out an application for the conference. And then we'll have the conference in the summer of 2027 before you all go back to school. And then the one thing I did want to point out was that if you sign up for this, if you participate, you are not obligated to participate in every single thing. We know you guys are busy. We know how much you do for your students and that you have families. And so don't think that like, if you want the database, then you have to see all the webinars. That is not the case. Everything will also be posted online for you to view at any time. But I just wanted you guys to know that this wasn't like kind of a all or nothing type of deal. We want you guys to be able to kind of pick and choose what you want to be a part of. And like I said, we can offer 100 spots for the conference, but we want you to be able to kind of choose your own adventure here. And we will provide informational sessions at the beginning of each release. So when we release the database in the summer, we'll hold another informational session like this, where George will go through exactly how to operate it, where you can find things, answer your questions, all of that, just so that we're not just throwing something at you and then you're like, I have no idea what to do with this. So we will make sure to do an informational session before we release each of these things. Next slide. So this is a QR code. I haven't checked it today because it's a free QR code. So if it doesn't work, the link is down below. Our website is firearmsresearchcenter.org. It's super easy to remember. And we've got Armed with Knowledge, which is the name of the grant. And if you haven't already signed up, although I'm pretty sure you all have, if you haven't already signed up, you can go to the website, sign up there, and you'll get email blasts as we put things out, as we schedule webinars. Also, feel free to share it with any of your colleagues if there's anyone that you think would be interested in this. We are opening this up to kind of all educators who are interested in the subject. So administrators, if you're interested in this, we don't want to limit people's ability to access this information. So please share with any of your colleagues, and we hope you guys will participate after tonight. And so I think if I'm correct, that's the last slide for me. And I will let Jody and George take it away and give you kind of a little preview of some of the conversations you're going to get to interact with.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashley. So our goal here tonight is for Jody and I to do a mini version, a very mini version, about 7 minutes each or so, with a short introduction before it, of what one of the webinars will look like, to kind of give a point counterpoint, one side, other side point presentation of a topic related to the Second Amendment. So what we'll do tonight is I'll take about 2 or 3 minutes to, excuse me, give you some background on why we have a Second Amendment. And Jody and I reviewed this outline and we agree on these points here. I'll then take about 7 minutes to set forth the individual right view of the Second Amendment. And the individual right view is the view that individuals, you and I and Jody and others, have a right to keep firearms or other weapons at home for various reasons. The Second Amendment protects the private ownership of firearms, maybe is the most accurate way to say it. And then Jody will do the same and talk about the collective right view. And that view holds that the Second Amendment protects some kind of collective right to use firearms in some circumstances. And that might mean that the state controls the right to who can have firearms and when through its militias, or that the population as a whole, as a collective, has that right, but that there's no individual right that someone can assert against, let's say, a legislature who wants to restrict some kind of firearm ownership. Um, I will say that of necessity, we'll only be covering a sampling of the items, of the many, many items in this debate, and only a sampling of even the various arguments on this individual versus collective right question. This was the big question from, well, really all the way up to 2008, when the District of Columbia v. Heller decision was decided, and the court there said that it was an individual right. And so you can think of this as, and even though we'll have an event on the topic, think of this as kind of a preview of everything that leads up to the modern Second Amendment questions. So I'll discuss 3 points, or I'll discuss points in 3 categories of why I believe it's an individual right. And those will be, I'll talk about some contemporaneous political commentary that happened around the time that the Second Amendment was enacted. I won't talk about anything around the second founding. That's a whole, again, it's just a sampling. I'll talk about the constitutional structure in which the Second Amendment is placed, and how James Madison originally wanted it placed, and how that interacts with Article 1 of the Constitution. And then I'll talk a little bit about the Second Amendment's text, and in particular, this use of the word militia and the words militia and people there. So first, the background, I promised. A constitution, when the Second Amendment was adopted, a constitutional convention had just been convened to replace the Articles of Confederation with a new constitution. The delegates at the convention generally agreed that the federal government should have more power than under the Articles, but many of them also feared that a too powerful federal government could become tyrannical, like the English monarchy that they had just freed themselves from, roughly 10, 12 years ago had become. And one thing in particular they feared was that the federal government would have control over a standing army, with which it could control the population. Tyrannize the population is the term you'll hear sometimes. Um, and so, in addition to adding some provisions limiting federal power, many of the delegates insisted on a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberty. And so, and getting a Bill of Rights was in fact a condition for one group that they called them, or they came at least to be called the Anti-Federalists. And the other group was the Federalists. Um, that was a condition for the Anti-Federalists for supporting the new Constitution's ratification. Um, and the Second Amendment, of course, is part of the Bill of Rights, and its text reads, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And so we're going to pick up the story here. And so I'll start now. I'll talk a little bit about the contemporaneous commentary. And most of this was public commentary, but as we'll see, some of it came in other contexts as well. And I'll start with one by James Madison, which also you'll notice has a militia mention. And that'll become relevant when we talk about the actual text of the amendment. And James Madison said in the Federalist that, quote, to a federal army would be opposed a militia amounting to near 500,000 citizens with arms in their hands. He mentions the militia there, but there are also many bits of commentary out there, of which I'll just mention about five here, that I think show that the Second Amendment meant to protect private arms ownership. There's one by Thomas Jefferson. Laws that forbid, quoting, laws that forbid the carrying of arms disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes, making the innocent defenseless. Tench Coxe was another founder there who really helped found the country. He said, the people are confirmed in their right to keep and bear their private arms. Alexander White was another one, and many of these names might not be familiar. They don't show up in kind of the standard textbooks, but they had really had a very large part in the founding of the country, often at the state level or even at the national level, but never sort of made it to public office, never became president or even senator. Alexander White, he referred to Tench Cox's reference to private arms ownership and said, yeah, and he added that, quote, Congress clearly has no power over rights such as the private bearing of arms. He said that in answer. He actually accused someone of being intellectually dishonest in suggesting that Congress could enact criminal laws that criminalize arms ownership. Um, Fisher Ames wrote that the right to bear arms is, quote, declared to be inherent in the people. And just one more from kind of this category. Noah Webster of dictionary fame, Webster's Dictionary, wrote that the federal government cannot enforce unjust laws because, quote, the body of the people are armed. There were several comments in the ratification debates as well, when the states were debating whether the new Constitution should be ratified. Patrick Henry said, the great object is that every man be armed. When this power is given up to Congress without limitation or bounds, how will your militia be armed? So note the militia mention again, and note his assumption that the militia is armed because the people are armed. So the militia is able to be armed because the people are armed. I'll just share one post-ratification bit of commentary by St. George Tucker. He was a law professor at William and Mary, the most famous constitutional law professor for quite some time, and I'd like to think still the most famous constitutional law professor, but some might dispute that. He said, the Second Amendment may be considered as the true palladium of liberty. Wherever the right of the people to keep and bear arms is, under any color or pretext whatsoever, prohibited, liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction. And he later said in that same volume, the right of self-defense is the same law of nature. In most governments, it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest limits possible. In England, the people have been disarmed. So that's the commentary that I think suggests that the right was meant to protect private arms ownership, protect individuals. I think there's support for that in the Constitution's structure as well. So Madison intended the Bill of Rights, which he proposed to the first Congress, to leave, quote, in his words, the structure and stamina of the government as little touched as possible. And so he originally actually proposed that the Second Amendment be inserted into Article 1, Section 9, between clauses 3 and 4, um, among other individual rights. Almost, imagine you're working on a student paper, you put a little caret and you write, extra words here, and you write the words that the students should have written. Clauses 2 and 3 protect individuals against unjustified writs of habeas corpus, bills of attainder, and ex post facto laws. Um, Madison also proposed that other individual rights in the Bill of Rights, so the future first, third, fourth, sixth, I'm sorry, first, third, fourth, eighth, ninth, and portions of the Fifth and Sixth Amendments also be inserted there into that area. Um, as happened in the end, it was and as we're familiar with, the Second Amendment and the rest of the Bill of Rights and all other changes to the constitutions were attached to the end of the Constitution as amendments. And the Second Amendment was, of course, in the Bill of Rights. I think another thing that supports it being an individual right is that bills of rights are about protecting individual interests. At the time, it was very popular to include them in for states' constitutions to have bills of rights. And the Second Amendment is placed among 9 amendments protecting individual rights. Um, Another structural claim that was made that, has been made or sometimes is made is that the Second Amendment intended only to allow states to arm their militias. But the Senate at the time, the first Senate, rejected the amendment that would have granted the states the power to arm and train their militias. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to call forth, arm, organize, discipline, and prescribe training for the militia. Now, recall that Madison proposed that the amendments should leave the balance of power between the state and federal governments alone. Um, if Congress has exclusive power or plenary power over the militia, which I think is more correct, given that the Senate rejected that proposed amendment that would have explicitly granted states the power to arm their militias, then a collective right model, or at least I shouldn't say the collective right model, but then the argument that the Second Amendment intended to allow states to arm their militias effectively holds that the Second Amendment repealed that part of Article 1, Section 8. But that was never on the table at the time. That was never discussed. It was just no one had any problem with Article 1, Section 8. So my thinking is that means the Second Amendment has to mean something else. Um, there is also a series of cases that effectively hold, and I do want to highlight that word effectively, that federal power over the militia is plenary. Every time a state fights with the federal government over some kind of control over the militia, the federal government wins every time. And then one last point here about the text of the Second Amendment. It's got this word militia, right? So what do we do with this really military sounding term? So militia at the founding and now refers to a very large portion of the citizenry, though not the entire citizenry, but a very large portion, whether or not they're actively in service. So a couple of other quotes by folks at the time, Richard Henry Lee, "A militia are in fact the people themselves, all men capable of bearing arms. To preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms." George Mason said, "Who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people." Um, Interestingly, this was new to me when I came into this field oh goodness, very long ago, 18 years ago at this point. It's hard to imagine that some statutory definitions support this. So the Militia Act of 1792 said, quote, "Each and every free, able-bodied white male citizen of the age of 18 years and under the age of 45 is part of the militia, and that each shall provide himself with a good musket or flintlock or firelock, excuse me, and not less than 24 cartridges, or with a good rifle, and shall appear so armed when called for service." And what's neat here is the current definition of the militia in the federal code today. and I'll again quoting, the militia consists of all able-bodied males at least 17 and under 45 years of age, and of female citizens who are members of the National Guard. And then it breaks militia down into the organized militia, which consists of the National Guard and the Naval Militia, and the unorganized militia consists of the members of the militia who are not members of the National Guard or the Naval Militia. The Constitution also differentiates between the active and inactive militia. Um, so one, but not the only purpose behind the Second Amendment is to ensure that the population could get private arms and participate in militia service when needed. And so I believe that that leaves the right belonging to the people, which also exists in the Second Amendment. And the Supreme Court has actually said that that term should be construed the same everywhere in the Constitution. So First Amendment, Second, Fourth, Fifth, et cetera. I think fundamentally the drafters are not likely to have used the language they did if they intended to protect the right of militiamen rather than the right of the population or the right of the people to bear arms. And with that, I think I've gone over 7 minutes, so I won't talk about the prefatory clause, but I will, however, turn it over to Jody.
Thank you, George. And so I'm going to pick up and I'm going to argue that the Second Amendment actually preserves only a collective or militia-centered right. I'm first going to discuss where that right comes from, what its constitutional basis is, and why it's been so historically important in understanding the right to keep and bear arms. So at the outset, the collective or militia-centered right sees the Second Amendment not primarily as a protection for individual or private gun ownership in isolation, but as a right grounded in participation in and therefore preservation of state-organized militias, like think the National Guard. And that's a protection connected to civic defense and Republican government, which actually devolves historically to a resistance to standing armies. And so we'll get into this. So I'm going to trace the roots of this perspective. I'm going to explain, first about the pre-Constitution and constitutional bases for the collective or militia-centered right. Then I'll address some historical arguments that scholars have used to support this collective right. And then I'll summarize and conclude. And so first, let's go back to pre-constitutional days. So before the Constitution was drafted, there's already a long Anglo-American tradition linking arms bearing to collective defense and political liberty. This goes all the way back to King Alfred the Great in ancient England. So in England, the militia is a cherished institution. In English constitutional thought, standing armies are often seen as instruments of tyranny. And the English Bill of Rights of 1689 actually recognized that subjects, for actually the first time, could have arms for their defense. And there is this, lots of anxiety among English citizens about disarmament by the king or by the crown. And so American colonial citizens understood the militia to be the body of ordinary citizens who served in the militia, who were available to defend towns, defend the state in terms of attack. So early state constitutions really reinforced this view by tying arms bearing to defense of the state. And they warned that standing armies in peacetime really threatened liberty. And so the Articles of Confederation that were in place before the Constitution also assumed the militia's importance by requiring each state to maintain a well-regulated and disciplined militia. So even long before the Second Amendment, there was already a powerful political tradition. There was this idea that a free society shouldn't only depend on a permanent professional army, but the people themselves, organized and disciplined into these defensive units, formed this really important barrier against tyranny and oppression. In the Constitution itself, proponents of this, collective right argue that the structure of the Constitution itself also gives a lot of evidence. So back to Article 1, Section 8, which George talked about a little bit ago. And again, this gives Congress authority to call forth the militia, to suppress insurrections, to repel invasions. It also gives Congress the power to organize, arm, and discipline the militia. This is critical. So the Constitution already treated the militia as a central institution of public security. And so when the Second Amendment was added against that backdrop, its text, what's called the prefatory clause, begins with a declaration of purpose, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Only then does it announce this operative language, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So from the militia perspective, that prefatory clause isn't just decorative, it's not wallpaper. It explains why the right to keep and bear arms mattered. And so it's a militia purpose that guides the interpretation of the rest of the amendment. It tells us why the right to keep and bear arms was there to help ensure the existence of a well-regulated militia, which in turn was thought necessary to the security of a free state. So in turn, scholars have raised many historical arguments which support this militia or collective rights perspective. So first, founders, again, had this widespread fear of standing armies. They associated standing armies with a monarchy. America was not a nation of kings. They didn't want coercion. They didn't want political repression. They had had enough. They had recent experience with the British military presence and Hessian soldiers. Revolutionary ideologies basically stressed liberty was threatened when armed power was concentrated in the hands of the central government. But if citizens were who became soldiers and they turned back into citizens, it was much less threatening, and that was much more consistent with Republican self-government. And this concern appears again and again in founding era debates. And so the militia, again, is not merely a military institution. It's a constitutional and a political safeguard for a free state. So also, the militia perspective is deeply tied to federalism. Many so-called anti-federalists warned that the new national government actually might neglect, weaken, or effectively disarm the state militias. And so if that happened, the states would actually lose a really important means of self-defense. If the militias were to go away, the people could not serve as a counterweight to excessive national power. And so the militia is not just about defense against foreign invasion. It's about preserving this balance of power between nation and state and between government and citizenry. So the drafting history of the Second Amendment also supports a militia-centered collective reading. So James Madison, in drafting this thing, was trying to make explicit basically what the Federalists argued was implicit in the Constitution, that the federal government had no powers to establish a national religion, no powers to establish to disarm people, to censor the press. And the original proposal for the Second Amendment tied the right to keep and bear arms directly to the value of a well-armed and well-regulated militia. So the first draft read something like this: the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country, but no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. Proposals against the standing army were rejected. Proposals to add for the common defense were rejected. And some early formulations, I think, explicitly describe the militia as composed of the body of the people. So even though the final language was shortened, it still retained the same basic structure. The militia is identified first as the reason the right is important. And this strongly suggests that the amendment was understood at a minimum as protecting an armed citizenry because of its role, public role in collective defense. Finally, before I conclude, I'd like to just discuss the meaning of individual terms in the Second Amendment and how they can be seen from the collective rights or militia-centered perspective. So first of all, the term well-regulated. The phrase well-regulated is especially important. In the 18th century context, it didn't mean prohibition. It meant properly organized, trained, disciplined, and functioning effectively. This point matters because the militia perspective doesn't celebrate private armed force disconnected from law. It emphasizes a lawful public institution under civilian control, not an individual private right, but disciplined citizen defense in service of the Republican order. A free state. Again, the purpose of the Second Amendment was to protect the state's share of divided sovereignty created by the Constitution. The people, the collective action of individuals, having a duty to serve in the militia. The idea of keeping and bearing arms. Keeping and bearing arms is one of the most powerful clues we have that the militia perspective is the right interpretation. So keeping arms, militiamen needed to store arms at home, ready for service when necessary. And linguistic scholars, for example, have done studies of historical documents. Bear arms means to carry weapons in military service. And many historical references with those phrases, with the phrase bear arms, uses that term in that context, in militaristic contexts. The word arms itself refers to weapons suitable for militia service. So in conclusion, if we pull these strands together, and the militia perspective emphasizes several themes. The armed citizen is part of a political community. There's a connection between arms bearing and public defense. There's a large distrust of centralized military power. The Second Amendment reaffirms the importance of state militias in the constitutional design, and it reaffirms the belief that liberty is actually more secure when the people retain the capacity to participate in collective defense. And so the collective perspective, or militia-centered perspective, thus understands the Second Amendment as actually having the civic and structural purpose, not merely a personal individual right. And so in conclusion, the militia perspective is rooted in a much older constitutional tradition than the Second Amendment itself. And it's best understood not simply as a statement about individual possession of weapons, but as this profoundly Republican provision where the security of a free state rests not solely on, again, a standing army, but on the people themselves. So I'll conclude there.
Thank you, guys. We had a couple of questions while, if you're not familiar with how the Zoom webinar works, down at the bottom, there's a Q&A feature. So if you have questions, you can type it in there, and then we'll either, if I can answer it quickly, I'll answer it quickly like I did. One of the questions was about sign up. So if you didn't already sign up on our website, George, I think the next slide has the QR code again, which again, I don't even know if it works because it was free. But if you haven't signed up through this link, then you're not signed up. But if you sign up through this link, you'll get all of the emails and everything. George, did you guys want to do any type of response, or do we want to just go in and see if people have questions? George, you're on mute.
I'd say let's let it rest and let's go to questions, because I think the goal is for one, to do an intro and just to show what these things will look like in practice. If that works for you, Jody, that's works.
Yes, and I'll just say, almost everyone agrees that there's an individual right these days. So, that's kind of the dominant interpretation. So,
yeah, and since I think there's also very few people think there isn't a militia component at the same time as well.
100%.
Individual right, folks. So
yes.
And that's one of the things that I think is so important for people to kind of understand, and hopefully we can help demonstrate it through the grant, is that there are a lot of areas where people disagree when it comes to the Second Amendment and guns. But I think a lot of people would be surprised at how often people who are on absolute opposing sides of things agree. We did almost like a beta test of this at our conference in the fall with George and another colleague of ours, Megan Walsh, at the University of Minnesota. And we talked about historical firearms laws from the founding era and how the same people can look at the same laws, the same history, the same technology, and still come to vastly different conclusions. But I think people probably were a little surprised at how often George and Megan did actually agree, which I think is really a piece of this conversation today that we don't necessarily get. So I'm excited about that component of it.
Yeah. I'll kind of add one thing onto that. The goal of the center, we've talked a lot about this grant, but it fits so nicely into the goal of our center, which is to be a nexus for all things related to firearms and a discussion locus, right? Locus of discussion. So I'm a law professor, Jody's a law professor, and we generally write law review articles, right? Ashley's a historian and a scholar of material culture, and she writes articles in those kinds of journals, right? On the history of firearms and what developed from there, right? And has got more expertise than anyone I know in that area. And the other folks on our advisory committee have that similar level of expertise in their areas. And our goal, both in the center and in this grant, is to bring all those conversations together into one spot in these little units that we look at or will look at.
Yeah, that was one of the things when we were creating the center that we really wanted, George, we didn't want it to just be a law shop since it's in the law school. And when George and I got connected, that was kind of the yin and the yang, the historian and the lawyer side of things. And we've branched out obviously into the public health world. We work a lot with the ATF. We work in the community. It's just been really, really great. So I'm hoping that you guys will get something out of the grant that we're doing. And I mean, everyone's pretty active. I mean, Jody, you do a lot of Second Amendment scholarship. We all work too with another. There's been a lot of firearms research centers popping up around the country, from the Duke Center, which is another law center, to several history centers, to a sociology center at ASU. So it's been kind of really interesting to see over the past few years. The scholarship in this area has really diversified, and it's a lot more broad than when even I got started, although that was 15 years ago at this point. So, but it's pretty nice. So, if anyone has any other questions, we can hang on for another, couple of minutes. But if not, we will let you guys get to your evening. And also, feel free to reach out to us. frc@uwyo.edu gets all of us. George and I have individual emails, but we'll kind of filter them out based on your questions. So we all get those. So any questions you have throughout all of this, we are happy to help. And we do also host a monthly webinar if you're just interested for the FRC's site. Earlier this month, George, it was on drug use and firearms ownership. We do a lot of kind of continuing legal education, but then we also have a lot of kind of doctors have been on and sociologists. So it's kind of interesting. So if you just kind of keep up with our website, you'll know all the things that we've got going on. We will be in touch soon. We'll get the webinar scheduled, and then we will let you know when the database is coming out and get you guys some logins for it. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone.